Human history is often told as a story of progress. Fire, the wheel, electricity, medicine, a long upward path toward comfort, safety, and understanding. But hidden beneath that familiar narrative is another story, a quieter one, a stranger one, a history filled with questions that never should have been asked. Experiments that went too far, inventions that solved problems no one truly had, and ideas that were pursued not because they were wise, but because they were possible. Tonight, we are not talking about science fiction. We are not talking about conspiracy theories, and we are not talking about imagined horrors. Everything you are about to hear actually happened. These were real experiments, real inventions, funded by governments, supported by institutions, defended by experts. At the time, many of them were considered reasonable, necessary, even brilliant. That is what makes them unsettling. Because progress does not always move forward gently. Sometimes it stumbles, sometimes it accelerates blindly, and sometimes it forgets to ask the most important question of all. Should we do this? Human curiosity is powerful. It is the engine behind every discovery we celebrate. But curiosity without restraint has always carried a cost. Throughout history, people have believed that knowledge justified sacrifice, that discomfort was temporary, that suffering was acceptable, that harm was an unfortunate but necessary step toward a better future. And often, those beliefs were shared by the smartest minds of their time. Doctors, scientists, engineers, philosophers. They did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as pioneers. This video is about those moments when curiosity outran caution, when invention moved faster than ethics, when progress arrived before wisdom. It is about the strange intersection between intelligence and blindness. Because history shows us something uncomfortable. The most dangerous ideas are rarely born from malice. They are born from confidence. Confidence that we understand the world well enough to reshape it. Confidence that consequences can be managed later. Confidence that someone else will draw the line. Again and again throughout history, that confidence proved misplaced. In some cases, the results were simply absurd. In others, they were tragic. And in many cases, they were both. You will hear about experiments that tried to improve the human mind, but damaged it instead. About inventions meant to make life easier, that made it more dangerous. About scientific pursuits that promised control but delivered chaos. Some of these stories involve laboratories and white coats. Others involve ordinary people placed in extraordinary situations. Many of them happened far more recently than you might expect, and several of them happened in places that considered themselves advanced, rational, civilized. What unites all of these stories is not failure. It is normalization. At some point, each of these ideas crossed a threshold. They moved from being strange to being accepted, from questionable to routine, from experimental to institutional. Once that happened, questioning them became difficult. When an idea is backed by authority, it feels safe. When it is supported by funding, it feels legitimate. When it is wrapped in the language of progress, it feels inevitable. And inevitability is dangerous. Because inevitability discourages doubt. This is why the history of strange experiments and inventions matters. Not to shock, not to entertain, but to remind us that intelligence alone is not enough. Without ethics, intelligence can justify almost anything. Without restraint, innovation can become indifference. And without reflection, progress can quietly turn into harm. As you listen, you may find yourself reacting strongly. Some stories may feel unbelievable. Others may feel disturbing. A few may even feel ridiculous. That reaction is natural. But try not to dismiss them too quickly, because the people behind these experiments did not see them the way we do now. They were responding to the problems of their time, the fears of their era, the limits of their knowledge. They believed they were building the future, and in many cases they truly thought they were helping. History rarely warns us in advance. It only explains itself afterward. That is why hindsight feels so clear. We can see the mistakes because we are standing on the other side of them. But clarity does not mean immunity. The same forces that shape these strange moments still exist today: ambition, competition, fear of falling behind, faith in technology. We still live in a world where being able to do something is often mistaken for a reason to do it, where speed is valued over caution, where innovation is praised before it is understood. The past does not accuse us. It reflects us. And as you listen to these stories, the most important question is not how strange they sound. It is how familiar they feel, because every era believes it has learned from history. Every era believes it has drawn the necessary boundaries, and every era is eventually proven wrong. This video is an invitation, not to reject science, not to fear progress, but to remember that progress is a tool, not a virtue. It requires guidance, limits, and humility. Without those things, even the most brilliant ideas can lead us somewhere we never intended to go. So take your time with these stories. Let them unfold slowly. Pay attention not just to what was done, but why it was allowed. Because the strangest inventions and experiments in history are not warnings about the past. They are questions for the present. And with that in mind, we begin our journey. Our first story takes us to a time when science became convinced that pain was not something to be avoided, but something to be used, a belief that would shape experiments, education, and medicine for generations, and leave behind a legacy we are still trying to understand. When pain was believed to improve humanity, there was a time when pain was not considered a problem to be solved. It was considered a tool, a mechanism through which the human body and mind could be improved, disciplined, and refined. To modern ears, this sounds cruel, but for centuries, many scientists, doctors, and educators believed pain served a purpose. Not accidental pain, intentional pain. Pain applied carefully, repeatedly, and systematically. In their view, pain strengthened the body, sharpened the mind, built character, and most importantly, pain revealed truth. This belief shaped some of the strangest experiments in human history. Experiments designed not to eliminate suffering, but to measure it, to control it, and in some cases to increase it. To understand why this idea became so powerful, we need to understand how earlier societies viewed the human body. Before modern neuroscience and psychology, pain was not seen as a signal. It was seen as a test of endurance, a test of morality, a test of worth. Many believed that a person's reaction to pain revealed their true nature. If you endured quietly, you were strong. If you broke, you were weak. This mindset influenced science, education, and medicine. In the 19th century, researchers began studying pain scientifically. Not to reduce it, but to map it. They wanted to know how much pain a human could tolerate, how long it could be sustained, and what effects it had on behavior. In laboratories, subjects were exposed to electric shocks, extreme temperatures, and physical stress. Their reactions were recorded meticulously. Heart rate, breathing, facial expression. Pain became data. And because these experiments were framed as scientific inquiry, they were considered legitimate. The subjects were often volunteers, but volunteer did not mean what it means today. Many were students, soldiers, prisoners, people with limited ability to refuse. Researchers believed they were uncovering universal truths, that understanding pain would help humanity survive harsher environments. Win wars, endure hardship, pain was framed as preparation. This belief extended beyond laboratories. In education, pain was used as discipline. Corporal punishment was common in schools, not as a last resort, as a standard method. Educators believed that physical pain reinforced memory. That fear sharpened focus. That discomfort made lessons stick. Students who failed were punished. Students who resisted were punished harder. The goal was not cruelty, the goal was obedience. And obedience, it was believed, produced better citizens. Medicine followed the same logic. Before anesthesia became widespread, many doctors believed pain was essential to healing. They argued that pain stimulated the body, that it prevented lethargy, that it kept patients alert. Some even believed pain helped fight infection. Suffering was interpreted as the body's way of responding correctly. If a patient felt pain, the treatment was working. If a patient did not, something was wrong. This belief delayed the acceptance of pain relief. Early anesthetics were viewed with suspicion. Doctors feared that removing pain would interfere with natural processes, that patients would become weaker, that healing would slow. Pain was not just tolerated, it was respected, but the most disturbing applications of this belief emerged in psychological experiments. Researchers began asking whether pain could shape behavior. Could fear be used to condition obedience? Could discomfort teach morality? Could suffering make people better? These questions led to experiments that crossed boundaries. In some studies, participants were instructed to administer pain to others. Electric shocks, punishment tasks, simulated authority structures. The goal was not sadism, it was insight. Researchers wanted to understand obedience, responsibility, moral decision-making, but in pursuing those answers, they normalized harm. Pain became acceptable as long as it served knowledge, and once pain is justified intellectually, it becomes easy to escalate. The logic is simple. If a little pain reveals truth, more pain might reveal more. This mindset created a dangerous slope, where the subject's suffering became secondary to the experiment's outcome, where distress was reframed as inconvenience, where ethics lagged behind curiosity. What is especially unsettling is that many of these experiments produced results. Not because pain improves humanity, but because pain is powerful. It changes behavior. People comply under threat. They obey authority when consequences hurt. They suppress doubt when discomfort is immediate. Researchers documented these patterns and presented them as discoveries. And in doing so, they reinforced the belief that pain was effective. Effectiveness, however, is not the same as morality. Pain can control behavior, but it does not create understanding. It can force compliance. But it does not build wisdom. That distinction took far too long to be recognized. Over time, cracks appeared in the belief system. Researchers noticed long-term damage. Subjects experienced trauma, anxiety, loss of trust. Pain did not strengthen everyone. It broke many. In education, harsh discipline produced fear, not curiosity. In medicine, untreated pain caused shock, complications, and death. In psychology, pain distorted results. People acted not because it reflected their true nature, but because they wanted the suffering to stop. Gradually, perspectives shifted. Pain began to be seen not as a tool, but as a variable, something that interfered with outcomes, something that introduced bias, something that harmed subjects and skewed data. Ethics committees emerged. Informed consent became a standard. The idea that pain must be justified, minimized, and carefully controlled gained acceptance. But again, this change did not happen because pain was declared wrong. It happened because pain was shown to be inefficient. Experiments without unnecessary suffering produced cleaner results. Patients recovered faster, students learned better. Compassion aligned with effectiveness. And only then did norms change. This story is not about barbaric scientists or cruel educators. It is about belief, the belief that suffering had meaning, that pain purified, that discomfort improved character. That belief shaped entire systems. And it persisted because it felt intuitive. Life was hard. Pain was unavoidable. So people assumed pain must be useful. But history shows us something critical. Pain is not inherently meaningful. It does not teach lessons on its own. It only signals limits. When those limits are ignored, harm follows. As we reflect on this story, it raises a quiet but important question. What do we still justify today because it is uncomfortable to challenge? What forms of suffering do we accept because they are framed as necessary? Stress, burnout, exhaustion. How often do we hear that struggle builds character, that pressure produces excellence, that discomfort is the price of success? The language has changed, but the belief remains that suffering improves people. History suggests we should be cautious with that idea, because once pain is justified, it becomes easy to ignore, and once it is ignored, it becomes easy to inflict. As we move to the next story, this theme deepens. Because pain was not the only thing science believed it could control. There was another belief, that the human mind itself could be isolated, stripped of stimulus, and studied in its purest form. A belief that led to experiments where silence became torture and loneliness became a weapon. When isolation became a scientific weapon, there was a time when scientists believed the human mind could be understood best in silence. Not calm silence, not peaceful solitude, but total isolation. They believed that if every external stimulus was removed, the mind would reveal its true structure, its instincts, its limits. To them, isolation was not punishment. It was a tool, a way to strip the human brain down to its most basic functions. And so, throughout the 20th century, a series of experiments began, experiments that asked a dangerous question. What happens when a human being is left alone with nothing but their thoughts? At first, the idea seemed reasonable. Psychologists wanted to understand perception, memory, consciousness. They believed that by removing sound, light, and social interaction, they could observe the mind in a neutral state, a blank canvas. But the human mind was never meant to be blank. Early isolation experiments were simple. Subjects were placed in quiet rooms, lights were dimmed, sound was reduced. At first, participants reported boredom, then discomfort, then something deeper. Time began to lose meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, hours collapsed into moments. Thoughts looped, memories replayed. The mind, deprived of input, began generating its own. Researchers took notes. They measured heart rate, breathing, sleep patterns. They expected adaptation. Instead, they saw deterioration. As experiments intensified, isolation became more extreme. Subjects were placed in soundproof chambers. Darkness became constant. Movement was restricted. Some experiments limited touch by floating subjects in tanks of body temperature water, sensory deprivation tanks. The body felt weightless. The skin felt nothing. The ears heard nothing. At first, some participants described the experience as relaxing, but relaxation did not last. Within hours, many experienced anxiety. Within days, confusion. Hallucinations followed. People reported hearing voices, seeing shapes, feeling presences that were not there. The brain, desperate for stimulation, created it. Researchers initially saw this as fascinating, proof that perception was internally generated, but fascination turned to concern. Some subjects begged to be released. Others became disoriented, paranoid, emotionally unstable, and some did not recover quickly. The effects lingered, nightmares, difficulty concentrating, heightened anxiety. Yet the experiments continued because the implications were powerful. If isolation could break down the mind, it could also be used strategically. During the Cold War, governments became interested. Isolation was no longer just a scientific curiosity. It became a method, Interrogation techniques incorporated sensory deprivation. Prisons used solitary confinement. Military research explored how long a person could be isolated before losing coherence. The logic was clinical. No physical harm, no visible wounds, just silence, just time. But silence was not harmless. Studies began documenting psychological collapse. People lost their sense of self. They struggled to distinguish thoughts from reality. They became suggestible, compliant. Isolation did not merely observe the mind, it reshaped it. One of the most disturbing realizations was how quickly this happened. It did not take years. Sometimes it took days, sometimes hours. Humans are social organisms. Our brains evolved in constant interaction. With sound, with faces, with touch. Remove those things and the brain begins to malfunction. Not slowly, rapidly. Yet for decades, isolation was defended. Because it left no marks. Because it was easy to justify. Because it could be framed as humane. After all, no one was being beaten. No one was bleeding. But suffering does not require violence to exist, and the absence of visible injury made isolation more acceptable. In prisons, solitary confinement became routine. Inmates were locked alone for 22 or more hours a day. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Some spent years isolated. Reports described hallucinations, panic attacks, depression, self-harm. But these reports were often dismissed. Isolation was described as necessary for safety, for order, for control. The same pattern appeared again. When harm is invisible, it is easier to deny. Scientific studies eventually caught up. Psychologists documented long-term damage, cognitive decline, emotional instability, increased risk of suicide. Isolation did not rehabilitate. It damaged. But even as evidence accumulated, change was slow. Because isolation was effective, it broke resistance. It enforced compliance, and in systems focused on control, effectiveness often outweighs ethics. What makes this story particularly unsettling is how intuitive isolation feels. When someone misbehaves, we separate them. When something is dangerous, we isolate it. The logic feels natural. But humans are not objects. We are not machines. Remove connection and we unravel. The early researchers who began these experiments did not intend to cause harm. They wanted knowledge. But knowledge gained without limits can become dangerous. Because once the effect of isolation was understood, it was used. Not to heal, but to control. Eventually, ethical standards began to shift. Long-term isolation was recognized as psychologically damaging. International human rights organizations condemned it. Some countries imposed limits, others did not. Even today, solitary confinement remains controversial, defended by some, condemned by others. The debate continues, but the science is clear. Isolation is not neutral. It is an active force. It alters perception. Identity, reality. This story forces us to confront a difficult truth. The mind is not strengthened by being stripped down. It is sustained by connection. Silence, when imposed, becomes noise. Loneliness, when prolonged, becomes trauma. And the idea that we can study humanity by removing humanity itself was a fundamental mistake. As we move forward, the next story takes this manipulation a step further. Because if isolation could distort the mind, some researchers believed something even more ambitious. That memory itself could be altered, erased, or rewritten. A belief that would lead to experiments where the past became a variable, and identity itself was no longer stable. When memory was treated as something that could be erased, there was a moment in the history of science when memory stopped being sacred. It became mechanical, something that could be adjusted, corrected, removed. Scientists began to believe that if the human mind could be understood like a machine, then memory was simply a faulty component, and faulty components could be fixed or replaced. At first, this idea felt hopeful. If memory caused suffering, why not remove it? If trauma shaped behavior, why not erase it? If fear controlled the present, why not rewrite the past? These questions did not come from cruelty. They came from optimism. The belief that science could liberate humanity from pain. But optimism can be dangerous when it ignores complexity. Early experiments focused on how memories were formed. Researchers studied learning, association, conditioning. They observed that memory was not fixed. It could be strengthened, weakened, distorted. That realization changed everything. If memory was malleable, then identity was too. In the mid-20th century, researchers began experimenting with memory disruption. Some used drugs, others used electrical stimulation. The goal was simple: interrupt the brain's normal processes and observe what remained. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, became one of the most controversial tools. It was introduced as a treatment for severe mental illness. Patients were given electrical shocks to induce seizures. Doctors believed this reset the brain. In some cases, symptoms improved. In others, something else happened. Memories disappeared. Not selectively, not gently. Entire periods of life vanished. Patients forgot names, faces, events. Some forgot who they were. Doctors initially dismissed this as a temporary side effect, an acceptable trade-off. Mental illness was severe. Memory loss, they believed, was manageable. But for patients, the experience was terrifying. Imagine waking up and realizing pieces of your life were gone. Not repressed, not blurry, gone. The line between treatment and erasure became thin. At the same time, other researchers explored chemical approaches. Psychoactive drugs were tested to see if they could weaken or alter memory. Some substances made memories feel distant. Others made them emotionally flat. The memory remained, but its weight changed. This fascinated scientists. If emotion could be removed from memory, trauma might lose its power. But altering emotional memory also altered judgment. Empathy, attachment, fear. These experiments revealed something unexpected. Memory is not a storage system, it is a process. Each time we remember something, we change it. Recall reshapes memory. This discovery opened another door. If memory could be reshaped during recall, it could be manipulated. False memories could be introduced. Details could be suggested. Entire events could be constructed. Researchers demonstrated that people could be convinced they experienced things that never happened. Lost in a mall, witnessing an accident, being harmed. The implications were staggering. Eyewitness testimony became questionable. Personal history became unstable. The past was no longer reliable. But instead of caution, this realization inspired further experimentation. If memories could be implanted, could behavior be controlled? Could fears be removed? Could loyalty be increased? Could beliefs be engineered? During periods of political tension, these questions attracted attention. Memory manipulation became a topic of interest beyond psychology. Governments watched closely. Not because they wanted to heal, but because memory shapes allegiance. Some experiments explored whether trauma could be erased to create more resilient soldiers. Others tested whether suggestion under altered states could influence beliefs. The line between therapy and coercion blurred. What troubled some researchers did not trouble others, because once memory was seen as flexible, altering it felt less invasive. After all, memories change naturally. Why not guide the change? But this reasoning ignored something essential. Memory is not just information, it is continuity. It is how we understand who we are. Remove or alter it, and identity fractures. Patients who lost memories did not simply forget events. They lost context. Relationships felt strange. Emotions disconnected. Life felt unreal. Some described feeling hollow, as if they were watching someone else's life. The cost of memory manipulation was not just confusion. It was alienation from oneself. Over time, ethical concerns grew. Patients spoke out. Long-term studies revealed lasting harm, depression, anxiety, loss of trust, not just in doctors, in reality itself. Because if memory could not be trusted, what could? Gradually, standards changed. Consent became more explicit. Limits were imposed. Memory-altering techniques were restricted, but the knowledge remained. We now know memory is fragile, that it can be influenced, distorted, rewritten, and that knowledge has never disappeared. Today, therapies exist that aim to reduce the emotional impact of traumatic memories. Drugs are studied that may weaken recall. Technology advances toward recording and modifying brain activity. The dream of erasing pain still exists, but so does the warning. Because memory, even painful memory, has a purpose. It teaches caution. It shapes empathy. It connects cause and consequence. Without memory, growth becomes impossible. This story forces us to confront a fundamental question. If we could erase our worst memories, should we? Would we still be ourselves, or would we become something smoother, calmer, and incomplete? The experiments of the past suggest that memory cannot be treated like a defect. It is the foundation of identity. Alter it carelessly and the self collapses. As we move to the next story, the subjects become even more vulnerable. Because some of the most disturbing experiments in history were not conducted on consenting adults. They were conducted on children. Children who had no voice, no choice, and no protection in the name of science. When children became acceptable test subjects, there was a time when children were not seen as individuals. They were seen as potential to be shaped, corrected, improved, and in the eyes of some scientists, they were also ideal subjects. Smaller bodies, developing minds, fewer objections. For much of modern history, the idea that children required special protection simply did not exist. Especially not children without parents, orphans. Institutionalized children, children born into poverty. They were already removed from society, already controlled, already dependent, and that made them convenient. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, science was accelerating. Medicine wanted answers, psychology wanted data, education wanted methods. Children became the testing ground. Not because researchers hated them, but because they believed children were adaptable, that young minds could recover, that harm, if it occurred, would be temporary. This belief justified almost anything. One of the most common justifications was education. Researchers believed childhood was the best time to shape behavior, so experiments were embedded into schools, classrooms became laboratories, teachers became enforcers, children were subjected to strict conditioning. Rewards and punishments were used to shape obedience. Mistakes were corrected with humiliation. Sometimes pain. The goal was not learning, it was control. Psychologists believed that behavior could be engineered from a young age. If you taught children to obey authority early, they would become compliant adults. And compliance was considered a virtue. But education was only the beginning. Medical experiments went further. Vaccines were tested on children before safety was fully understood. New drugs were administered to observe reactions. Dosages were adjusted through trial and error. Side effects were documented, sometimes ignored. Consent was assumed. After all, parents wanted what was best for their children, and institutions wanted progress. In orphanages, oversight was minimal. Children had no advocates. They were fed experimental diets to test nutrition theories. Some were deliberately deprived of certain nutrients. Scientists wanted to see what would happen, what deficiencies would emerge, how bodies would respond. These experiments produced data. But they also produced lifelong damage, stunted growth, cognitive impairment, chronic illness. At the time, these outcomes were described as unfortunate, necessary. The children were rarely informed. Often they never knew why they were sick. Psychological experiments were even more invasive. Children were subjected to fear conditioning, exposed to loud noises, threatening stimuli, isolation. Researchers wanted to understand how phobias formed, how fear could be learned. In some cases, fear was deliberately induced, not to cure it, but to study it. The assumption was simple. Children were resilient. They would forget, but many did not. The fear followed them into adulthood. What makes these experiments especially disturbing is how ordinary they felt at the time. They were not secret. They were written about, published, presented at conferences. Other scientists debated methodology, rarely ethics, because ethics had not yet caught up with ambition. There was also a belief that children belonged to society, not to themselves. Parents were encouraged to trust experts. Institutions were seen as benevolent. If a doctor recommended participation, refusal felt irresponsible. And for children without parents, refusal was impossible. In some cases, children were deliberately misled, told procedures would help them. That discomfort was temporary. That pain was necessary. The language of care was used to justify harm. As science advanced, so did justification. Researchers argued that understanding childhood development would improve education, that medical breakthroughs would save future children. That sacrifice now meant benefit later. This argument was powerful, and it silenced doubt. But the cost was real. Many children left these experiments with lasting trauma. Distrust of authority, fear of medical environments, a sense that their bodies were not their own. And because they were children, their voices were often dismissed. They did not have the language to describe what happened. Their experiences were filtered through adult interpretation. Over time, cracks appeared. Some researchers began questioning the morality. Parents began asking questions. Journalists investigated. The idea that children required special protection slowly emerged, not because harm was new, but because harm was finally acknowledged. Laws were introduced, ethical guidelines were written, informed consent became more than a formality. Children were recognized as vulnerable. But again, this change came late and unevenly. Even today, debates continue about testing new drugs on children, about consent, about risk versus benefit. The legacy of these early experiments still shapes policy and still shapes mistrust. This story challenges a comforting belief that science naturally protects the innocent. It does not. Science follows incentives. Without boundaries, it will use whatever is available. And for a long time, children were available. Not because they were valued, but because they were powerless. As we move to the next story, the focus shifts again. Because scientists did not stop at shaping behavior or memory. Some believed humanity itself could be upgraded, enhanced, transformed. They believed technology could create stronger, faster, more resilient humans. And in pursuing that dream, they crossed boundaries that still unsettle us today. When science tried to upgrade humanity, there was a moment in modern history when ambition stopped asking modest questions. It asked the biggest one possible. What if the human being itself could be improved, not educated, not healed, not protected, enhanced, stronger than nature intended, faster than evolution allowed, more resilient than biology designed? For scientists driven by progress, this was not fantasy. It was engineering. The idea did not begin with comic books or fiction. It began with war. In times of conflict, nations have always searched for advantage. Better weapons, better machines, better strategies. Eventually, attention turned inward. What if the soldier could be improved? What if endurance could be extended, pain suppressed, fear reduced? What if the human body could be optimized like a machine? Early experiments focused on stimulation. Electricity fascinated scientists. It made muscles contract, limbs move, bodies react. Researchers believed electricity was the key to unlocking hidden potential. Experiments were conducted where electrical currents were applied to muscles to increase strength. The results looked promising at first. Muscles responded, movement intensified, but strength gained through stimulation faded quickly, and repeated exposure caused damage. Nerves misfired, muscles weakened, pain intensified. Still, the idea persisted. If electricity could activate muscle, perhaps chemistry could sustain it. Drugs became the next frontier. Stimulants were tested to increase alertness. Amphetamines were given to soldiers to reduce fatigue. At first, they worked. Soldiers stayed awake longer. Reaction times improved. Endurance increased. But the cost emerged later. Crashes, psychosis, addiction. Bodies pushed beyond limits broke down. Minds fractured. But during moments of crisis, those consequences were often ignored. Because the immediate benefit mattered more. This mindset spread beyond the military. Scientists began experimenting with hormone manipulation, testosterone, adrenaline, growth hormones. The belief was simple. If the body could produce performance-enhancing chemicals naturally, increasing them artificially must improve performance. Some subjects experienced short-term gains, increased muscle mass, reduced pain sensitivity, but long-term effects were severe. Organ damage, aggression, psychological instability. The body resisted being optimized. It pushed back. Another approach focused on the brain. If physical limits could not be eliminated, perhaps mental limits could. Researchers explored ways to improve reaction time, focus, and obedience. Sleep deprivation was studied. How long could a human function without rest? At first, performance declined gradually, then sharply. Hallucinations appeared, judgment failed, reality blurred. Yet the experiments continued because knowing the breaking point was considered valuable. If limits could not be removed, at least they could be mapped. Some scientists believed pain itself could be suppressed entirely, that fear responses could be conditioned away. Experiments attempted to reduce emotional reaction through conditioning and drugs. The goal was a human who could act without hesitation, without doubt, without empathy interfering. But emotion was not a flaw. It was a safeguard. Remove it, and decision-making collapsed. Subjects became reckless, detached, unpredictable. The dream of the enhanced human began to fracture. But it did not disappear. Technology advanced, prosthetics improved, exoskeletons were developed to augment strength. Unlike earlier experiments, these were external. Machines attached to the body rather than altering it. This approach showed promise, but it raised new questions. Where does the human end and the machine begin? Who controls the enhancement? And what happens when enhanced humans return to normal life? Even as physical augmentation shifted toward technology, the desire to enhance remained. Genetics entered the conversation. If traits could be inherited, could they be selected? Early genetic research inspired dangerous ideas that intelligence, strength, or obedience could be engineered. These ideas fed into eugenics, the belief that humanity could be improved by controlling reproduction. This was not fringe science, it was mainstream. Respected institutions supported it. Policies were enacted. Forced sterilizations occurred, lives were permanently altered, all in the name of improvement. The concept of the superhuman had crossed a line. It was no longer about enhancing individuals. It was about deciding who deserved to exist. History records the consequences of this thinking clearly. But at the time, many believed they were acting rationally. They believed they were preventing suffering. reducing weakness, creating a better future. What they created instead was harm. Because enhancement assumes a definition of perfection, and perfection is subjective. Who decides what traits matter? Who decides what limits should be removed? Who bears the risk? Again and again, the same pattern appears. The desire to improve humanity leads to experiments that reduce humanity instead. Subjects become test cases, lives become variables, suffering becomes acceptable if it promises progress. Over time, enthusiasm faded, the failures accumulated, the harms became undeniable. The dream of the superhuman did not disappear, but it changed form. Enhancement shifted from biological to technological, from altering bodies to assisting them, from forcing change to offering tools. Even today, the question remains: should we enhance humans, or should we adapt society to humans as they are? Technology still tempts us with shortcuts, pills to focus longer, devices to track performance, algorithms to optimize behavior. The language has softened, but the impulse is the same: to exceed limits, to outrun biology. This story is not a warning against progress. It is a warning against impatience. Human beings are not problems to be solved. We are systems shaped by trade-offs. Remove one limit, and another appears. Enhance one ability, and another weakens. Nature rarely gives without taking something in return. The experiments to create superhumans failed not because science was wrong, but because the question was. Improvement without understanding is damage, and enhancement without ethics becomes control. As we move to the next story, the focus shifts again. Because not all dangerous inventions were designed to improve humans. Some were designed to protect them, to make life safer, more convenient, more efficient. And in doing so, they introduced risks no one had anticipated, inventions that were celebrated as solutions, until they began causing harm. When safety became the most dangerous idea, not every dangerous invention was created with reckless intent. Some were created with the opposite goal: to save lives, to reduce risk, to make the world safer. That is what makes them so unsettling. Because the most harmful inventions in history were not always weapons. They were solutions. They were designed to protect, and they were trusted. Throughout history, people have placed enormous faith in technology. When something is invented to solve a problem, we assume it understands that problem better than we do. We assume it will behave predictably. We assume it will make things better. But history shows us a different pattern. When safety becomes a selling point, scrutiny often disappears. One of the earliest examples comes from the industrial age. As factories spread, machinery became larger and faster. Accidents were common. Workers lost fingers, arms, lives. Engineers responded by inventing safety mechanisms: guards, shields, automatic shut-off systems. These innovations were celebrated. They made machines appear less threatening. But appearances can be deceptive. Some safety devices made workers less cautious. When danger feels contained, behavior changes. People take risks they would never take otherwise. Machines were trusted more. Attention slipped, and accidents did not disappear. In some cases, they increased. This phenomenon would later be called risk compensation. When people feel safer, they behave more dangerously. But at the time, no one had a name for it. They only saw the irony. Devices meant to protect workers sometimes encouraged the very behavior that caused harm. Another example emerged with transportation. As cars became faster, engineers focused on protecting drivers. Seatbelts were introduced, airbags followed, crumple zones were designed. Each innovation reduced fatalities in specific scenarios. But they also changed how people drove. Speed increased, aggression rose, attention waned, safety features saved lives. But they also created new risks. The invention was not wrong. The assumption was that safety devices alone could compensate for human behavior. The most chilling examples come from medicine. Devices designed to prevent infection, treat disease, improve hygiene. Some of them worked, others did not. One such invention was the early radiation machine. When X-rays were discovered, they were hailed as miraculous. Doctors could see inside the body, tumors could be located, broken bones diagnosed. Radiation was invisible, painless, and at first it seemed harmless. Doctors exposed patients repeatedly. Technicians handled equipment with bare hands. Radiation was even used for non-medical purposes. Shoe stores used X-rays to fit shoes. People exposed themselves casually because nothing seemed wrong. The damage came later: burns, cancer, organ failure. By the time the danger was understood, countless people had been harmed. The invention was revolutionary. The understanding was incomplete. Another example involved early fireproof materials. As cities grew denser, fire became a major threat. Engineers searched for materials that would not burn. They found one: asbestos. It was cheap, durable, resistant to heat. It was hailed as a miracle, used in buildings, factories, homes. Asbestos was everywhere, and for decades no one questioned it. Because fires decreased, buildings survived, safety improved, until people began to fall ill. Asbestos fibers lodged in lungs. Diseases appeared years later. Cancers developed slowly. By the time the connection was made, millions had been exposed. The material that protected buildings destroyed bodies. Another case involved medical devices meant to prevent harm during childbirth. Instruments were designed to assist delivery, to reduce trauma, to save infants. Some devices were poorly tested. Forceps were misused. Procedures were standardized without evidence. Injuries occurred. Mothers suffered long-term damage. Babies were harmed. Doctors trusted the tools. They believed technology compensated for skill. But tools magnify mistakes as easily as they magnify precision. One of the most tragic patterns in these stories is delay. Harm rarely appeared immediately. The invention worked. At first, short-term success masked long-term consequences. By the time patterns emerged, the invention was already widespread, too embedded to easily remove. Another layer of danger came from authority. When an invention is endorsed by experts, questioning it feels irresponsible. Patients trust doctors, workers trust engineers, citizens trust institutions. This trust is not naive. It is necessary for society to function. But when trust becomes automatic, it becomes dangerous. Warnings were often dismissed. Early signs were ignored. Those who questioned safety were labeled alarmists. Progress could not be slowed. Profit played a role. Once an invention is profitable, resistance increases. Industries defend it. Research is funded selectively. Uncertainty is minimized. The narrative becomes fixed. This is safe. This is necessary. This is progress, and when harm becomes undeniable, responsibility is diluted. No one intended this. No one knew. No one is to blame. But the damage remains. These stories reveal something essential. Safety is not a property of an object. It is a relationship between technology and human behavior, between intention and context, between use and understanding. An invention does not exist in isolation. It changes how people act, how they think, how they take risks. Designing for safety without understanding behavior is incomplete. And assuming technology can replace judgment is dangerous. The most unsettling part is how familiar this pattern feels. Even today, we celebrate new technologies for their safety benefits. Automated systems, smart devices, algorithms designed to prevent error. And yet, the same question remains. Do these systems make us safer? Or do they make us less attentive, less responsible, more dependent? History suggests the answer is rarely simple. Inventions do not eliminate risk. They redistribute it, they move it, they hide it. The danger shifts from visible to invisible, from immediate to delayed, and invisible dangers are the hardest to confront. This story is not an argument against innovation. It is an argument against certainty. The belief that a solution ends a problem, that technology closes a chapter. In reality, it opens a new one, with new risks, new behaviors, new blind spots. The inventions that harmed the most were not failures, they were successes. Successful enough to be adopted widely, trusted completely, and defended fiercely until the cost could no longer be ignored. As we move to the next story, the focus shifts again, because some experiments were not about safety or improvement. They were about control, about shaping behavior, about understanding how far authority could go, and what people would do when told to obey. When authority learned how far obedience could go, there was a moment when science stopped asking how humans think and began asking how humans obey. Not criminals, not extremists, ordinary people, neighbors, students, office workers, people who believed themselves to be moral, decent. In the middle of the 20th century, psychologists became obsessed with a question that haunted the modern world. How could ordinary people participate in extraordinary harm? This question was not abstract. It emerged from history, from war, from genocide, from systems that functioned only because millions complied. The unsettling possibility was this: perhaps cruelty did not require hatred. Perhaps it only required instruction. To test this idea, scientists designed experiments that looked simple on the surface, harmless even. Participants were told they were helping with research. They were assigned roles, given instructions, assured that everything was under control, and then slowly responsibility was removed from their hands. One of the most famous experiments placed volunteers in a room with switches. Each switch was labeled with increasing levels of punishment. Participants were instructed to administer shocks to another person whenever that person made a mistake. The shocks were fake. The screams were recorded, but the participants did not know that. They believed they were causing pain, severe pain. The experimenters wore lab coats. They spoke calmly. They assured participants that the experiment required continuation. And most participants obeyed. Not all, but enough to reveal something deeply unsettling. People did not obey because they were cruel. They obeyed because they trusted authority, because responsibility felt shared, because stopping felt like disobedience. The participants showed visible distress, sweating, trembling, hesitating. They asked if they should stop, and when told to continue, many did. The shock levels increased. The imagined pain intensified, and still obedience persisted. The conclusion shocked the public. Not because people were violent, but because they were compliant. The experiment suggested that under the right conditions, ordinary people would act against their own moral instincts. Not out of malice, but out of submission. This was not the only experiment. Others explored conformity. Participants were placed in groups, asked to judge simple facts, obvious answers. But when everyone else in the room gave the wrong answer, many participants followed. They doubted their own perception. They trusted the group. Even when reality was clear, social pressure altered judgment. Researchers discovered that the desire to belong often outweighs the desire to be correct, and belonging often feels safer than truth. Another set of experiments simulated environments of power. Participants were randomly assigned roles. Some became guards, others became prisoners. The setting was artificial, but the behavior became real. Guards began asserting dominance. Prisoners became submissive. Cruelty emerged without instruction. not because participants were told to be violent, but because the structure encouraged it. Power changed behavior. Authority reshaped identity. Within days, the experiment spiraled out of control. Emotional breakdowns occurred. Psychological harm was evident. The study was stopped early. The results were undeniable. Roles matter. Systems matter. When people are given power without accountability, behavior changes. And when people are placed under authority, resistance fades. These experiments revealed patterns that were deeply uncomfortable. Obedience does not require belief. Conformity does not require agreement. Participation does not require intent. All it requires is structure, clear roles, clear expectations, clear authority. Once those are in place, morality becomes negotiable. This knowledge did not remain in laboratories. It influenced institutions, military training, corporate hierarchies, education systems. Understanding obedience became a tool, and like all tools, it could be used for different purposes. Some used it to improve leadership, others used it to enforce compliance. The line between influence and manipulation blurred. What made these experiments especially disturbing was how easily participants rationalized their actions. They said they were following orders, that responsibility belonged elsewhere, that the experiment required it. Language shifted. "I hurt someone" became "I was instructed." This distancing reduced guilt, and once guilt is reduced, behavior escalates. The experiments also revealed something else. Resistance is possible. Some participants refused, some questioned authority, some walked away, but they were the minority, and their resistance came at a cost: discomfort, social pressure, conflict. Resisting authority is psychologically difficult. It requires confidence and isolation. History shows us that systems rarely reward resistance. They reward compliance. That is why these experiments mattered. They forced society to confront a disturbing reality. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a badge, a title, a uniform. Sometimes it speaks calmly, professionally. And sometimes it asks politely, "Please continue." The legacy of these experiments is complicated. They taught us about obedience, but they also harmed participants. Ethical standards were violated. Trust was broken. Psychological damage occurred. After public backlash, guidelines were tightened. Informed consent became essential. Debriefing became mandatory. Deception was restricted. But the knowledge could not be erased. We now know how easily behavior can be shaped, how authority can override conscience, how structure can suppress empathy. This knowledge forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How often do we obey without questioning? How often do we defer responsibility? How often do we assume that someone else has thought it through? Modern life is filled with systems, workplaces, algorithms, institutions. Decisions are often distributed. No single person feels responsible, and when responsibility is diluted, harm becomes easier. The experiments did not reveal monsters, they revealed mirrors. They showed us ourselves under pressure, under authority, under expectation, and that is what makes them enduring, because the conditions that produced obedience still exist. They are built into modern life. The lesson is not that humans are weak, it is that humans are social. We look to others for cues, we trust structures, we assume legitimacy, and unless we are taught to question, we comply. As we move to the next story, the focus shifts again, because some inventions were not about controlling behavior. They were about solving problems no one truly had, ideas that seemed brilliant, innovative, futuristic, but ultimately unnecessary, and in some cases harmful, when invention raced ahead of need. When invention outran necessity, there was a time when invention was driven by survival: food, shelter, protection. But as societies stabilized, invention took on a different purpose, not to solve problems that already existed, but to anticipate problems that might never come. Engineers and inventors began asking a new kind of question. Not what do people need, but what could exist if it did. This shift created some of the strangest inventions in history. Machines that were impressive, complex, expensive, and ultimately unnecessary. At first, these inventions were celebrated. They represented progress, proof that humanity was moving forward, but over time a pattern emerged. When invention moves faster than need, usefulness becomes secondary, and without usefulness, innovation becomes spectacle. One early example came from transportation. As cities grew, inventors imagined a future of congestion and chaos. They designed elaborate personal transport systems, single-person vehicles, mechanical walking machines, motorized platforms meant to replace walking itself. Some worked, briefly, but they solved no real problem. Walking was already efficient. The inventions were heavier, more fragile, more dangerous. They required maintenance, fuel, training. They were not improvements, they were novelties. Yet investors funded them. Exhibitions showcased them. Because they looked like the future. In the home, similar patterns appeared. Inventors created machines to automate simple tasks, devices to peel fruit, to butter bread, to fold paper. Each invention removed seconds from an activity that already took moments. The cost of the machine outweighed the time saved. But that was not the point. The point was automation, the belief that everything should be mechanized, that human effort itself was a flaw. This belief intensified during the 20th century. As electricity spread, inventors raced to electrify daily life. Some inventions were transformative, others were absurd: electric hairbrushes, self-stirring pots, automatic tie adjusters. They promised convenience, but delivered complexity. They broke easily. They required power. They added steps instead of removing them. Yet they sold, because novelty sells. The presence of technology itself became desirable. An invention did not need to be useful. It needed to feel advanced. This mindset extended beyond consumer products. Military research produced devices for hypothetical scenarios. Weapons designed for environments that did not exist. Machines built to counter threats that never materialized. Entire programs were funded based on speculation. What if this happens? What if that changes? The result was a surplus of solutions in search of problems. Some of these inventions were harmless curiosities. Others were not. In medicine, devices were created before their necessity was understood. Machines designed to monitor health metrics that had no proven relevance. Procedures invented to correct conditions that were not harmful. The presence of technology created anxiety. If something could be measured, it must be measured. If it could be adjusted, it must be adjusted. Normal variation became pathology. Invention created need where none existed. This phenomenon had a psychological effect. People began to feel inadequate without technology, as if life without enhancement was incomplete, as if human capability alone was insufficient. This belief fueled further invention. A feedback loop formed. Technology created expectations. Expectations demanded new technology, and necessity became irrelevant. One of the most telling examples involved office productivity. As computers entered the workplace, software promised efficiency, faster communication, better organization. Some improvements were real, others were superficial. Complex systems replaced simple processes. Emails replaced conversations. Dashboards replaced judgment. Work expanded to fill the space technology created. Efficiency did not increase. Stress did. Yet the tools were not questioned. because questioning them felt regressive. The same pattern appeared in education. Technologies were introduced to modernize learning. Tablets, platforms, analytics, some helped, others distracted. The presence of technology became a goal in itself, not a means. Students learned how to use systems rather than how to think. Teachers adapted to tools rather than needs. Again, invention preceded understanding. What makes these stories particularly unsettling is that the inventors were often sincere. They believed they were improving life. They were not acting out of greed alone. They were driven by possibility, by the excitement of creation. The problem was not intention. It was perspective. When inventors fall in love with their creations, they stop asking hard questions. Does this actually help? Who benefits? What does it replace? And perhaps most importantly, what does it cost? Cost is not always financial. Sometimes it is cognitive. Attention, focus, agency. When technology performs tasks for us, we lose skill. When it makes decisions for us, we lose judgment. When it predicts our needs, we lose awareness of them. These costs are subtle. They do not appear immediately, which makes them easy to ignore. In some cases, inventions created entirely new risks. Devices meant to simplify life introduced failure points. Power outages caused paralysis. System errors cascaded. Human oversight diminished. The more complex the system, the harder it was to understand. And when systems failed, no one knew how to fix them because knowledge had been outsourced. This story is not an argument against innovation. It is an argument against innovation without humility. The belief that because something can be built, it should be. The belief that the future must always be more complicated than the present. History shows us that progress is not linear. Sometimes improvement comes from addition. Sometimes it comes from subtraction. Some of the most effective solutions are simple, durable, boring, but boredom does not attract investment. Spectacle does. So invention continues to race ahead, producing devices that look impressive, sound futuristic, and quietly solve nothing. The danger is not that these inventions fail, it is that they succeed just enough to change behavior, to shape expectations, to redefine normal. Once people adapt to unnecessary technology, going back feels impossible. The invention becomes embedded, not because it is essential, but because it is familiar. This is how societies accumulate complexity, not through need, but through habit. And complexity, once accumulated, resists removal. As we approach the final stories, the theme sharpens. Because some experiments and inventions were not merely unnecessary, they were so extreme that they crossed clear ethical lines. Lines that once crossed forced humanity to ask whether some knowledge should remain unknown, whether some experiments should never be repeated, and whether curiosity itself requires limits. Experiments that crossed the line. There are moments in the history of science when curiosity did not just go too far. It crossed a line that once crossed revealed something deeply unsettling. That knowledge can be gained in ways that permanently damage our sense of morality. These were not accidents. They were deliberate choices, experiments designed with clear intent, executed with planning, and defended with logic. At the time, they were justified, necessary, some argued, urgent, others insisted. But history has judged them differently. These are the experiments we now say should never be repeated, not because they failed, but because they worked. One of the most disturbing patterns in these experiments is how calmly they were conducted. Procedures were written. Subjects were selected, variables were controlled, everything followed scientific protocol. Except one thing: human dignity. In some cases, researchers believed extreme conditions were required to understand extreme behavior. They subjected people to prolonged stress, deprivation, fear, pain. They wanted to know what humans would do at the breaking point. How loyalty collapsed, how morality fractured, how identity dissolved. Subjects were pushed far beyond normal limits. Sleep was removed, food restricted, social contact eliminated. Some were told they were in danger, others were told their actions could harm someone else. The pressure was constant, unrelenting. Participants began to show signs of breakdown, confusion, emotional numbness, loss of self-control. Researchers documented everything, not intervening, because intervention would compromise results. In other experiments, deception was central. Subjects were misled about the nature of the study. They believed they were helping science, helping medicine, helping society. In reality, they were being observed to see how long they would comply, how much harm they would tolerate, how responsibility could be displaced. The deception did not end when the experiment ended. Some participants were not fully informed afterward. They left confused, disturbed, questioning their own morality. The psychological damage lasted longer than the study itself. Some never fully recovered. What makes these experiments especially troubling is that many produced valuable data. They revealed uncomfortable truths, that people can be pushed to harm others, that authority can override conscience, that stress can dismantle identity. These findings shaped psychology, informed policy, influenced institutions. But the cost was immense, and the question remains, was the knowledge worth the harm? Another category of experiments involved extreme environments. Scientists exposed subjects to conditions that mimicked disasters: high pressure, low oxygen, extreme temperatures. The goal was to understand survival, but the margin for error was small. Subjects suffered lasting injuries. Some died. These experiments often involved military contexts. The argument was pragmatic. Better to risk a few lives in testing than lose many in war. This logic appears repeatedly in history. Sacrifice the few to save the many. But this reasoning depends on who decides and who is sacrificed. Often, subjects were chosen because they were expendable. Prisoners, soldiers, institutionalized individuals. People with limited power to refuse. Consent, when obtained, was ambiguous. Pressure was implicit. Authority was present. Choice was constrained. In medical research, some experiments deliberately withheld treatment. Not because treatment was unavailable, but because researchers wanted to observe natural progression. Disease was allowed to worsen. Pain was allowed to increase. Lives were allowed to end. Researchers watched, took notes, published results. At the time, this was framed as scientific necessity. But necessity is a flexible word. It can justify almost anything, especially when those harmed are distant from those deciding. Another set of experiments focused on long-term psychological manipulation. Subjects were exposed to repeated stress, contradictory information, unpredictable punishment and reward. The goal was to break down resistance, to observe reprogramming. The results were alarming. People lost confidence in their perceptions. They became dependent on authority for reality itself. The experiments demonstrated how fragile the human sense of self can be, and how easily it can be dismantled. These findings were quietly absorbed, used in training, in interrogation, in persuasion. The experiments themselves were later condemned, but the knowledge remained. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths of science. Knowledge does not disappear when methods are rejected. It persists, and it is used. The ethical backlash came slowly. Public awareness grew. Journalists investigated. Survivors spoke. Documents surfaced. The gap between intention and impact became impossible to ignore. Codes of ethics were written. Institutional review boards established. Informed consent formalized. Rules were created to prevent repetition, but these rules emerged only after harm occurred, after lines were crossed, after damage was done. This story challenges a comforting assumption that science is self-correcting. In some ways it is, but correction often comes too late, after harm reveals the flaw, after suffering forces reflection. The experiments that should never be repeated taught us something essential, not about human limits, but about our own, the limit of curiosity without compassion, the limit of progress without restraint, the limit of believing that ends justify means. Because once we accept that idea, the means can become anything. The language used to defend these experiments is familiar. We hear it whenever harm is rationalized. This is for the greater good. There was no other way. We had to know. History urges us to be cautious of such statements. They often precede regret. The knowledge gained from these experiments did not make humanity wiser by itself. Wisdom came later, when society decided some questions were not worth answering at any cost, that some lines exist not to limit knowledge, but to protect what makes knowledge meaningful. As we move toward the final story, the perspective widens, because the most dangerous moment in the history of science is not when experiments go wrong. It is when science moves so fast that ethics cannot keep up. When capability outpaces reflection, and when humanity risks losing control of the very tools it created. When science outpaced ethics. There is a moment in the life of every powerful idea when it stops asking permission. Science reached that moment long ago, not because scientists became reckless, but because progress accelerated faster than reflection. Tools became more powerful. Experiments became more complex, consequences became harder to predict, and slowly the distance between action and outcome grew. In the early days of scientific discovery, cause and effect were close. You mixed substances, you observed reactions, you tested ideas, you saw results. Mistakes were immediate. Failure was visible, but as science advanced, that relationship changed. Actions began producing consequences far in the future. Outcomes appeared years later, sometimes decades. By then, responsibility had dissolved. The original decision-makers were gone. The systems they created remained. This is the moment when science began to outrun ethics, not because ethics were abandoned, but because they could not keep pace. New discoveries opened doors faster than society could decide which ones should remain clear. Nuclear science was one of the clearest examples. At first it was theory, abstract, mathematical. Then it became energy, then a weapon. A single discovery reshaped global politics, warfare, and fear. The scientists involved understood the power they were unleashing. Some warned against it, others believed control was possible. Once the technology existed, restraint became optional. Deterrence replaced morality. The question was no longer whether something should be done. It was whether it could be stopped. The same pattern appeared in chemical research. Substances were developed for industrial efficiency. Agriculture, manufacturing. They increased productivity, reduced cost, but their environmental impact was poorly understood. Chemicals entered water, soil, food chains. Effects accumulated slowly. Health problems emerged years later. By the time connections were established, the chemicals were everywhere. Removing them became impossible. Science had already moved on. Biology followed a similar path. As understanding of life deepened, the ability to manipulate it increased. Genes could be isolated, edited, transferred. At first, this promised cures, disease prevention, longer lives. But it also raised questions no one was prepared to answer. Who decides what is normal? What traits should be changed? What risks are acceptable? The technology advanced regardless. Capabilities expanded, debates lagged behind. In many cases, decisions were made by default. If something could be done, it was done. Not because consensus existed, but because competition demanded speed. In research, being first matters. Funding flows to innovation, prestige follows discovery, caution slows momentum, and momentum, once established, is difficult to stop. This dynamic created a subtle shift. Science stopped being guided by values. It began shaping them. What was possible began to define what was acceptable. Ethics became reactive, responding after harm occurred, after public concern, after consequences surfaced. The pattern is consistent. A new technology emerges, it is celebrated, it spreads quickly, concerns are dismissed as fear, then harm appears slowly, unevenly, and finally regulation follows, late, incomplete. This delay is not accidental, it is structural. Ethics require consensus. Science does not. Discovery can be driven by individuals. Reflection requires societies. One moves faster than the other. As systems grew more complex, control weakened. No single person understood the entire system. Responsibility fragmented. When something went wrong, blame was diffuse. It was the system, the process, the unintended outcome. No one intended harm, and intention became the shield. This is one of the most dangerous illusions of modern science. That harm without intent is acceptable. That accidents are morally neutral. That progress excuses collateral damage. But history suggests otherwise. Unintended harm still harms, and systems built without foresight still cause suffering. The loss of control was not dramatic. It did not happen overnight. It happened quietly, through delegation, automation, specialization. Scientists focused on narrow problems, engineers optimized components, institutions scaled operations. No one looked at the whole. And when consequences emerged, they seemed disconnected from the original decisions. This distance made accountability difficult, and without accountability, restraint weakened. Another factor accelerated this loss of control: trust. Society learned to trust science deeply, and for good reason. Science delivered vaccines, electricity, communication, comfort. Trust became habitual, automatic. When science spoke, society listened. But trust without scrutiny is fragile. It assumes alignment between capability and wisdom. History shows that alignment is not guaranteed. The more powerful science becomes, the more humility it requires. Yet humility is rarely incentivized. Caution does not attract headlines. Restraint does not win grants. Ethical hesitation does not produce immediate results. So science continues forward, not maliciously, relentlessly. The question is no longer whether science is good or bad. It is whether it can govern itself, whether systems designed for discovery can also enforce limits, whether those limits will be chosen intentionally or imposed by catastrophe. This story is not about fear of knowledge. It is about the responsibility that comes with it. The most unsettling realization is this: science does not have a natural stopping point. It does not know when enough is enough. That decision must come from outside, from values, from culture, from ethics. When those forces are weak, science fills the vacuum, not because it wants to dominate, but because it does what it does best. It moves forward. The experiments and inventions we have explored throughout this video share a common thread. They did not fail because science was wrong. They failed because science was alone, separated from empathy, from context, from long-term thinking. When science is isolated from ethics, it becomes powerful and blind. When ethics are isolated from science, they become idealistic and ineffective. Progress requires both, but balance is difficult, and history shows that imbalance is common. As we stand in the present, surrounded by technologies more powerful than ever before, this story feels unfinished. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, automation. These are not future possibilities, they are present realities. The questions we face now echo the past. Just because we can, should we? Just because something works, is it right? Just because harm is delayed, does it matter less? History does not give us simple answers, but it gives us patterns, and the pattern is clear. Whenever science moves faster than ethics, society pays the price later. Sometimes in lives, sometimes in trust, sometimes in ways that cannot be undone. This final story does not ask us to slow progress. It asks us to walk alongside it, to question, to pause, to accept that not every door must be opened immediately, that some knowledge carries responsibilities we may not yet be ready to bear. Because the most dangerous moment in the history of science is not ignorance. It is certainty without reflection. And when science believes it no longer needs guidance, it becomes something else entirely. Not discovery, but momentum. And momentum once lost is difficult to regain. As we step away from this story and into the final reflection, one truth remains. Science is a tool, one of the most powerful humanity has ever created. But like all tools, it reflects the hands that wield it, and whether it builds or destroys depends less on what it can do, and more on what we choose to do with it. When progress forgot to ask why. As we reach the end of these stories, it is tempting to label them as mistakes, errors made by less informed times, failures of early science, missteps on the road to progress. But that explanation is too simple. Because these experiments and inventions did not happen in ignorance. They happened in confidence. Each one was built on certainty. Certainty that the question was worth asking. Certainty that the method was justified. Certainty that the future would forgive the cost. History shows us something uncomfortable. Progress rarely stops itself. It moves forward until something pushes back. Sometimes that push comes from ethics, sometimes from public outrage, sometimes from irreversible harm. The experiments you've heard about were not driven by evil intent. They were driven by belief. Belief in science, belief in efficiency, belief in improvement. And belief, when left unchecked, can be as dangerous as ignorance. Again and again we saw the same pattern. A new capability appears, excitement follows, questions are asked too late. Human beings become variables, suffering becomes data, and responsibility becomes abstract. When harm appears slowly, it is easier to deny. When victims are distant, it is easier to justify. When benefits are immediate and costs are delayed, progress feels inevitable. This is how lines are crossed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. The most unsettling realization is not what science did in the past. It is how familiar these stories feel. We still live in a world obsessed with optimization. We still believe problems can be engineered away. We still trust that smarter systems will save us from our own limitations. And we still assume that if something is possible, it is probably necessary. The language has changed, but the impulse remains. Today we talk about algorithms instead of conditioning, data instead of observation, enhancement instead of improvement. We no longer shock bodies or isolate minds in laboratories. But we test attention. We measure behavior. We experiment at scale quietly. Every time a system is deployed without understanding its impact, we repeat an old pattern. Every time efficiency is valued over well-being, we echo these stories. Every time harm is explained away as unintended, history nods in recognition. This does not mean science is the enemy. Far from it. Science has extended life, reduced suffering, expanded understanding. But history reminds us that science is not morality, it is capability, and capability without guidance is directionless. One of the most dangerous myths we tell ourselves is that ethics will naturally catch up, that we can move fast now and reflect later. History shows us the cost of that belief. Reflection almost always arrives after damage, after trust is broken, after harm becomes visible, and sometimes after it is too late to undo. The stories in this video are not warnings against curiosity. They are warnings against certainty, against the belief that intelligence alone is enough, against the assumption that good intentions guarantee good outcomes. The people behind these experiments believed they were right. They believed they were helping, and that belief allowed them to look away from suffering. That is the true danger, not cruelty, but distance. Distance between action and consequence, distance between decision and responsibility, distance between innovation and empathy. When that distance grows, anything becomes possible. So what are we meant to take from this? Not fear, not rejection of progress, but humility. The understanding that progress is not a straight line, that every new capability carries trade-offs, that every experiment reflects values whether acknowledged or not, and that some questions, even if they can be answered, may not need to be. History does not ask us to stop moving forward. It asks us to slow down enough to look sideways, to see who is affected, to ask who bears the risk, to question who benefits, and to remember that the absence of immediate harm does not mean the absence of harm at all. The strangest experiments and inventions in history were not failures of intelligence. They were failures of restraint. They remind us that wisdom is not measured by how much we can do, but by what we choose not to do. As we leave these stories behind, one thought should remain. The future will judge us just as we judge the past, not by what we believed, but by what we normalized. And the question is not whether future generations will find our era strange. They will. The question is whether we are willing right now to question what feels normal, because progress does not need permission, but humanity does. And whether science serves us or overwhelms us will depend on something history has made painfully clear. Not what we are capable of creating, but what we are brave enough to limit.